Consider James Patterson. His first novel was rejected by 31 publishers before Little Brown finally said yes in 1976. That book, the Thomas Berryman number, went on to win the Edgar Award for Best First Novel. Critical acclaim right out of the gate. But even so, Patterson's first bestseller didn't arrive until 1993 with Along Came a Spider. That was his 7th novel. 17 years, 7 books. Now today, he's sold over 425 million copies worldwide and holds the Guinness World Record for the most #1 New York Times bestsellers by a single author. But it took nearly 2 decades of persistence before he broke through. If he hadn't persisted, he wouldn't be the huge name in publishing we know today. That's what patience looks like in this industry.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter-century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 448 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Today's episode is a solo episode. I'll be honest with you, I ran out of time to get to the interviews and edit the interviews, so I thought it'd be easier to upload an episode where I've read some essays that I've recently shared on my Substack. I'm actually going to release 2 episodes this week. This episode is going to be a topic of when your writing gets rejected a gazillion times, and the next one is going to be related to even if you think you've bypassed the gatekeepers, you still have to do some of this work. So, this is me reading this essay that I posted in the last couple of weeks over on Substack. I thought for the convenience of my listeners, if you don't get over there and have time to read it, I thought I'd just read it. It's about a 20-minute essay or so. And of course, as I'm reading it, I didn't just read it word for word. I added some things as I sometimes do. But that is coming up later in this episode. First, let's hear a word about this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by my book, The 7 Ps of Publishing Success. And I'm sponsoring it with my book because I want to give you this book for free. I have a link that you can find in the show notes for episode 448 at starkreflections.ca, where you can get access to the ebook or the audiobook of the 7 Ps of Publishing Success. And one of the reasons I'm doing that is I thought these essays that I'm going to share with you in the next couple episodes are very specifically related. These ones are very specifically related to patience and persistence. 2 of the P's. I always said patience, practice, and persistence were the 3 strongest P's of publishing success. But what this book is it's me having worked in the industry for decades, looking at and tracking successful authors on both the traditional publishing and the self or indie publishing side of things, and looking for common traits. And I landed on the 7 P's, and I want to give that book to you. Now, I don't have an easily speakable URL for it, but if you go to starkreflections.ca for episode 448, there will be a link where you can get access to this book in audio or in ebook format. And the audio, by the way, is read by me, the human, not the digital AI voice of Mark Leslie Lefebvre. And quickly, a comment from a recent episode that I missed in recent episodes from Sylvie Soul over on YouTube for episode 445, Overcoming the Self-Sabotage from Buried Trauma with Andrea Torre Balsara. Sylvie says, very deep video, thankful to Andrea for sharing her vulnerability. I was a big tomboy in high school and didn't have a lot of friends. But one Valentine's Day, the school was selling roses, and someone decided to buy me one. To this day, I never figured out who it was, but I always remembered that kind gesture. reminded me that I had value and I mattered, and I started to take better care of how I presented myself to the world. Like that verse says from Flying Dreams and The Secret of Nim, love is the key. And thank you so much for sharing that, Sylvie. I love that. It's the perfect example of somebody just doing something kind for someone else. I hope that hearing this story from you helps someone who's listening to this now remember to take the time to do something kind and generous and thoughtful for another person, whether it's someone you know who may be struggling, going through something, just to reach out to them and show them a little bit of compassion. It can make the world of difference. Think about this. How many years has it been since that happened? And that still resonates with you. We always talk about the world being a dark place and people being mean to one another, but honestly, it's stories like this that give me strength and hope and conviction of the goodness of humanity and the goodness of people. So, Sylvie, thank you so much for sharing that story. It's so great to see how impactful that interview with Andrea was. Absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for sharing. And just a reminder, you can share comments over at starkreflections.ca. You can share them over on YouTube, where Sylvie shared it. You can also, speaking of YouTube, if you're over on YouTube, I'm still 5 people shy of getting to 1,000 people, and it feels like I've been there for months. I haven't actually, but it feels like I've been there for months. Feel free to subscribe to me over on YouTube. But I see the comments at starkreflections.ca, Spotify, and YouTube, and what I'm going to have to do is make a note of going through and making sure I'm checking for comments. So thank you, Sylvie, for that comment. And that is it for comments. Let's roll a bumper and I can introduce this next bit. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is me reading an article that I recently wrote. I read it too. I read it multiple times and rewrote it and tweaked it and blah, 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 as I do, and shared. And I thought it would be impactful for you because I've been getting a lot of great comments from folks over on Substack. And just to let you know, this is sort of personal update, is the reason I thought it would be important to do the articles is I think about a lot of things, I reflect on a lot of things, and I wanted to share them while I was reflecting. In this particular case, it was a sort of an interaction I had with an author who was asking for some help or for some advice. And I thought, I spent 20 minutes, 30 minutes or more composing a thoughtful response. And I thought, okay, great, that helped that one author. How can I help the rest of the community? And when I think of the community, some of the first people I think about are you, because you're listening, and I appreciate that, and I wanted to share it with you. Now, if you've read it already, my apologies, but maybe you enjoy hearing it again, because it was even funny, even reading it back myself just today, I was reminded of the importance of those things, and hopefully you'll find something that resonates with you. So there will be no post-interview kind of reflection. It's just going to roll the bumper. I'm going to read that article, and we'll end that episode. But very shortly after this episode goes live, the next episode, episode 448, will also go live, and that will be sort of the part 2. That way it's in slightly more digestible chunks with a little bit of an intro, etc., etc. All right, let's roll the bumper, and let's get into this. Rejection to the left of me, rejection to the right, stuck here in publishing with you. Part 1. When your writing gets rejected a gazillion times, why patience and persistence are 2 of the hallmarks of publishing success. The other day in a private author group chat, a fellow writer recently shared their frustration about a science fiction novel they'd written that had been rejected more times than they could count. They were looking for someone to read it and tell them what was wrong with it. Well, they used a different set of words, though. They said it had been rejected a gazillion times, and they wanted someone to read it and tell them why it sucked. While I didn't have time to read the manuscript, I am a slow reader with too many projects, research books, and blurb commitments already stacked up on my desk. Not to mention a pleasure to be read pile that's already a mile high. I did still have some perspective to share that might help them. Since this is a discussion I've had with countless writers over the years and is also aligned with the first book I'd written to help writers, The 7 Ps of Publishing Success, I thought it was worth sharing some of that perspective here. First, let's get one thing straight. Really good novels get rejected every single day. No, let me correct that. Incredibly great novels get rejected every single day. When I started writing and submitting to fiction markets in this industry back in the mid-1980s, there were 12 major publishers. Today there were 5, maybe 6. Yes, thousands of smaller and regional presses are doing fantastic work out there. But the simple math is that there aren't nearly as many markets as there used to be for the continually growing number of submissions that publishers have to deal with. A major publisher might receive hundreds to thousands of submissions and queries, likely more, every month. And from that deluge, known in the industry as the slush pile, they can only accept perhaps a dozen, sometimes fewer. It depends on the imprint or catalog. And tens of thousands of books aren't rejected because they're bad. They're rejected because the publisher is already stuffed. They've had their fill of excellent submissions and have no room for more. Think of it like that scene in an old Monty Python film where you're the waiter offering someone a wafer-thin mint at the end of an enormous buffet. The mint might be delicious, but they simply cannot take another bite. Or else. In that classic scene from The Meaning of Life, Mr. Creosote is convinced to eat the mint, and he explodes. In the world of publishing, considering how over the decades since I've started in this industry, publishers have merged and consumed other ones, it's been less of an explosion and more of an implosion. But the result is simply this: less opportunity for writers. Hundreds of fantastic books get passed over every single month because the right editor didn't get it at the right time. When it came up in their reading, perhaps something about it appealed to them, but they'd already just accepted a similar manuscript, or they recently published a book that appeals to the same audience and they can't have two of the same. Not that year, at least. They don't have the means or processes to put things aside. Not in a world where another 1,000 manuscripts sit at their transom calling to them like some classic Greek siren. If a single science fiction imprint publishes 48 to 60 books per year, which is Dawes' typical rate, and if many of those slots go to existing authors already under contract with a publisher, the number of spots available for new authors might only be a handful, maybe 3 to 10 per year. Meanwhile, that same imprint might be receiving over 1,500 submissions monthly. It's like you're running your manuscript through a gauntlet with a series of 10-foot walls dropping down right in front of you at random. And it's more like a lottery, even for genuinely good work. But here's something worth paying attention to. If you've received any sort of personal note from a rejecting editor, anything beyond the vague "it's not right for us at this time," you should take that as a great sign. Yes, even if it's a hastily jotted scribble from that editor, that brief personal note is an indicator, a hidden message, if you will, that your manuscript has something of value or merit and is worth continuing to submit. I learned this lesson submitting to a World Fantasy Award-winning Canadian horror anthology series, Northern Frights. It was edited by Don Hutchison. Though I never got into the anthology with my horror fiction, I received the best rejections from Don. In virtually every submission I sent, which did get rejected, Don made a short handwritten note that accompanied the standard RS. That's rejection slip, RS being short for that, with the token "not right for us at this time" statement on it. Sometimes the notes mentioned a little thing that could improve the story. It may have been a small change here, a minor tweak there, but with most of the stories I'd submitted and that he rejected, he took the time to make a note. When I did meet Don in person years later at some industry event, and this was prior to me having published a book and prior to the internet and social media allowing for an easy connection, when shaking my hand, Don said something that fascinated me. "Ah, yes, Mark Leslie," he said. That's the name I write most of my stories and books under. "I recall that name. Nice to meet you. I'm so sorry we never connected on any of the stories you'd sent me over the years. I quite enjoyed them." I was shocked. He knew who I was? He liked my stories? Quickly overcoming my shock that he even knew who I was, I responded by thanking him for the notes and the feedback he'd shared with me. I also told him that I appreciated them and I'd taken them to heart, followed his suggestions, fixed the stories, and ended up selling most of these same stories to other markets. All thanks to him taking the time to help me out, even though he hadn't been able to use my stories in his wonderful anthology series. You see, I knew, even back then, that his notes were an indicator to not abandon hope on publishing that story, that it would find a home if I didn't give up. Similarly, years prior to becoming good friends with Kevin J. Anderson, I'd sent a couple stories his way when he'd been editing the humorous horror anthologies for HWA, Horror Writers Association, formerly known as Horror Writers of America. Both stories were rejected, but one of them had come with a brief note that it had made him laugh. A few years after we'd become friends over beer and poutine on a street-side patio in Hamilton, Ontario, I'd mentioned a short story of mine that I was working at turning into a novel called A Canadian Werewolf in New York. It was a humorous urban fantasy tale about a poor schlep living in Manhattan who turned into a wolf every full moon and had to deal with the side effects of the curse. Things like waking up butt naked in Battery Park with no memory of his time spent running on all fours, howling at the moon, and having to figure out how to find some clothing to get back home. He stopped me mid-sentence to ask if I'd sent it to the HWA anthology at one point. I said I had. He replied by saying, yes, he thought it sounded familiar. He remembered reading that story. It made him laugh. He quite liked it. It was almost a decade later, and yet he still remembered it, even though it ultimately didn't make the final cut. That's the second lesson here. Editors pay attention. They remember the good, but they also remember the truly bad and, of course, the truly ugly. That's where the traits of professionalism and partnership come into play. Elements from my book that I won't get into here because I've already sidetracked myself enough. But just remember, editors and publishers and other industry players, they remember if you're being a dick. They remember that so well. At an anthology workshop with Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush a few years back, they reminded the writers that editors do pay attention. For years, they both edited Pulp House magazine, and Chris edited the magazine of science fiction and fantasy. They shared that when they saw the same names repeatedly submitting to them, though they'd never met them, those authors became familiar. They even rooted for them. Even when they couldn't buy their stories, they saw something noteworthy in those writers. They'd make notes on those submissions because they wanted the writer to keep sending them something else. Perhaps one day the right story from that author would arrive at the right time. And whenever that writer stopped sending them stories, they felt disappointment. Because they recognized the talent, the skill, the passion, and they were hoping that with perhaps their next submission, things would connect in the right way. As in the right submission from the right writer to the right editor at the right time. That magic. But the magic faded because that writer gave up. I've edited more than half a dozen short story anthologies over the years, so I'm familiar enough with the overwhelm of hundreds of manuscripts to consider for perhaps a dozen slots. I rarely ever have time to make notes on stories I had to reject because of the sheer volume of submissions received. But when I did take the time to leave a comment, it was because I saw something truly worthwhile in either the story, the writer's voice, or both. One story I rejected for an anthology, went on to win first place in that year's Writers of the Future contest. I absolutely love this remarkable science fiction story, but I couldn't publish it in an anthology I was contracted to produce because of constraints outside of my control. But I told the author it was a fantastic sale and to keep sending it to other markets. He did, and he became that year's grand prize winner for Writers of the Future. The author, Stephen Kotowicz, is now a World Fantasy Award finalist, an Aurora Award winner, and the series editor for both the year's best Canadian fantasy and science fiction and the Nebula Award Showcase. That rejection I had to hand him wasn't about quality, it was about fit. I couldn't fit it at the time, but I knew it was a good story. So what made the difference for Kotowicz? The same thing that makes the difference for most successful writers: persistence. He didn't let one rejection, or a dozen, convince him that the work wasn't worthy. He kept submitting until the story found its home. But you might ask, what if there's no feedback? If you haven't received any personal comments on your rejections, it might be time to take a hard look at what's not connecting. Often the culprit lives in those critical opening pages. One of the best books I've read on making a manuscript's opening more compelling is Noah Lukeman's The First 5 Pages, a writer's guide to staying out of the rejection pile. Lukeman is a New York agent, and his perspective on what makes those initial moments grab or lose an editor is invaluable. Even 2 decades after the book was released, it resonates because he shares an agent's perspective on dealing with the slush pile. But beyond the manuscript itself, your pitch, your proposal, your cover letter need to be rock solid. That material is really sales copy, and its job is to convince the editor or agent that they must read this book. A recent resource I've found exceptionally helpful is manuscriptreport.com. It'll ingest your novel and produce a detailed summary along with marketing copy, much of which helps generate a solid synopsis, a look at target audience demographics, comparable titles and authors, tropes and themes, even a draft press release that can be useful for crafting a compelling cover letter. If you're interested in checking out Manuscript Report and use the coupon code MARK10 at checkout, you can save 10% on their various services. And yes, full attribution, that is an affiliate code. Now, the insights could be helpful in helping to create a solid pitch to an agent or a publisher. Or, if you're taking the more DIY approach, it'll likely help you with generating useful sales copy, custom pitches to specific audiences, and the understanding of some solid comp titles for your book ad targeting. But playing the long game is important. Now, here's a sobering statistic. The average age at which authors publish their first bestseller is nearly 49 years old. That number's been climbing for decades. In the 1950s, it was 44 and a half. For thriller writers specifically, the average is 52. And of all the fiction authors who've appeared on the New York Times bestseller lists, only 14% got there with just one book. The other 86% kept writing. Consider James Patterson. His first novel was rejected by 31 publishers before Little Brown finally said yes in 1976. That book, the Thomas Berryman number, went on to win the Edgar Award for Best First Novel. Critical acclaim right out of the gate. But even so, Patterson's first bestseller didn't arrive until 1993 with Along Came a Spider. That was his 7th novel. 17 years, 7 books. Now today, he's sold over 425 million copies worldwide and holds the Guinness World Record for the most #1 New York Times bestsellers by a single author. But it took nearly 2 decades of persistence before he broke through. If he hadn't persisted, he wouldn't be the huge name in publishing we know today. That's what patience looks like in this industry. The bottom line is this: unless an editor or agent has explicitly told you your work isn't good, and if you've worked hard at the practice of creating writing and have continued to progress in developing your skills and writing ability, I sincerely doubt that it isn't. I spent a lot of time thinking about and tracking what makes writers successful. Enough that I wrote a whole book about it, The 7 P's of Publishing Success. And 2 of those P's keep coming back to me whenever I have conversations like this one. Patience and persistence. Rejection isn't failure. It's just part of the journey. Patience is critical because this industry moves slowly. Because readers take time to find you. Because the path from first draft to published book to building an audience can stretch across years, not months. Sometimes it can stretch across decades. We live in an era of instant gratification where anyone with access to the internet can publish an ebook to 190 countries with a few clicks. But even that bypassing of the gatekeepers in traditional publishing doesn't mean readers will show up overnight. They rarely do. The slush piles that used to only haunt the transoms of New York publishers now live in an online catalog at a retailer near you. It's harder to be found and to be seen, even if a book is published. Remember, the average best-selling author is nearly 50 years old when they hit that list for the first time. James Patterson was 40. Most book bestsellers are roughly 49 years old before they hit that. They didn't give up in their 20s or 30s when things weren't working. They kept at it. They kept persisting. Persistence goes hand in hand with patience because rejection is not the end. It's part of the process. Every successful author I know has a stack of rejection letters or a folder full of rejection emails somewhere in their history. Patterson had 31 rejections before his first yes. My good friend Kevin J. Anderson, who's published nearly 200 titles and sold more than 23 million copies of his books worldwide, was once presented with a humorous trophy for being the writer with no future, because of the enormous number of rejection slips he accumulated by weight early in his career. The ones who made it are the ones who kept going anyway. Don't give up. You already did the work. You worked hard to write the thing. Maybe it's time to look at different ways of approaching those same high walls, those same barriers. That's where progression comes into play. But you did this because you believed in it, and you saw it through. Most people say they want to write a book. Most never will. But you did. You're already miles and miles. Heck, you're light years ahead of them. So don't give up. Be patient. Persist. I spent more than 30 years in this industry as a bookseller, a bookstore manager, a digital publishing rep, and a writer myself. I've seen countless authors give up one rejection too soon. And I've watched others persist through years of no until they finally broke through. The math is brutal, and the reality is hard. But virtually every single one of those overnight success stories of writers that you hear about was built on a foundation of patience and persistence. 2 of what I call the 7 P's of publishing success. Your rejection isn't a verdict on your talent. It's simply part of the journey. So take a breath, send out the next submission, and keep writing. The only writers who truly fail are the ones who stop.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.